At 11:27 on the morning of December 21st, 1943, First Lieutenant Leon Crane sat in the right seat of a B-24 Liberator climbing through 20,000 feet over eastern Alaska, watching ice crystals form on the cockpit glass as his pilot searched for a hole in the clouds that probably wasn't there. 24 years old, 12 months as a co-pilot, city boy from Philadelphia who'd never spent a night outdoors in his life. The B-24's number one engine had just quit at 20,000 feet, and the vacuum selector valve had frozen solid. This wasn't supposed to be a dangerous flight. Ladd Field ran these cold weather tests 3 times a week. Take a B-24 up to altitude, see how the systems handled minus 40 degrees, bring it back. The 5-man crew had radioed their position twice, once at 10:03, again at 10:30. They were roughly 120 miles east of Fairbanks. Routine. Until Second Lieutenant Harold Hoskin spotted what looked like a break in the cloud deck and started a climbing turn to push through. The clouds closed around them like a fist. Instrument conditions. Visibility under 3 miles. And then the port outboard engine coughed once and died. The B-24 pitched forward into a spin. Crane grabbed the yoke. Hoskin was already hauling back with everything he had. The bomber was falling from 20,000 feet in a corkscrew, picking up speed with every rotation. Radio operator Ralph Wenz managed to key the mic long enough to report engine failure and spin. Not enough time to give coordinates. The centrifugal force pinned everyone to their stations. Crane could feel the blood draining from his head. His vision started tunneling. But Hoskin somehow broke the spin. They came out straight into a 300-mile-per-hour nosedive. The airspeed indicator was buried past redline. The altimeter unwound like a broken watch. Hoskin gave the order to bail out. 2 men were still strapped in at their stations. Radio operator Ralph Wenz, waist gunner James Seibert. They never made it out of their seats. Flight engineer Richard Pompeo grabbed a parachute. Crane grabbed the other one. Pompeo jumped first through the bomb bay doors. Crane followed 3 seconds later. The cold hit him like a wall. Minus 40 degrees, maybe colder. The exposed skin on his face burned instantly. His hands went numb before he pulled the ripcord. He saw Pompeo's parachute drifting away over a mountain ridge, maybe a mile distant. And he saw the B-24 spiral into the mountainside and erupt in a ball of orange flame that turned the snow black for 200 yards in every direction. Crane landed in snow up to his waist. He shouted for the others. His voice disappeared into the silence. He shouted again. Nothing. He was alone on a mountain he couldn't identify, more than 100 miles from anywhere, with no survival training and no idea which direction led to safety. The Army didn't teach city boys from Philadelphia how to survive in the Arctic. They taught them how to fly bombers. His inventory was simple. 1 Eddie Bauer down parka, 3 pairs of wool socks inside mucklucks, a silk parachute, a Boy Scout knife, 40 matches. A letter from his father that he'd stuffed in his shirt pocket that morning. The temperature was dropping. He needed fire or he'd be dead by morning. His hands were already losing feeling. He stumbled downhill through the deep snow toward what looked like a frozen stream. The Charley River. He didn't know its name. Didn't know it ran north for 90 miles before joining the Yukon. Didn't know he'd just landed near its headwaters in one of the most remote corners of Alaska. All he knew was that rivers meant driftwood, and driftwood meant fuel. He built a fire using his father's letter as kindling, wrapped himself in the parachute, and spent his first night listening to the wind. If you want to see how Crane survived with 0 training and no food in minus 50-degree cold, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Crane. For 9 days he waited by that fire. 9 days without food. He tried to kill squirrels with a makeshift spear he carved from spruce branches. The squirrels were faster. He tried a bow and arrow. Missed every shot. He chewed on vegetation but couldn't swallow it. His body was eating itself. He drank snow and pretended it was a milkshake from the base commissary. The hallucinations started on day 7. And on the morning of December 30th, Leon Crane made a decision. He could die waiting for a rescue that wasn't coming, or he could walk. He started downstream. Every step was a gamble. 1 sprained ankle, 1 broken leg. The cold would finish what the crash had started. The snow was hip-deep in places. Crane pushed through it, following the frozen river downstream, because it was the only landmark he had. No compass, no map, no idea if this stream led to a village 10 miles away or the Arctic Ocean 300 miles north. But staying put meant certain death, and walking meant a chance. His pace was glacial, maybe half a mile per hour through the drifts. The December sun gave him 4 hours of weak light before the darkness came back. Then he'd stop, build another fire, wrap himself in the parachute, sleep in 2-hour intervals because the cold woke him up every time the fire died down. Unwrap, gather wood, feed the flames, rewrap himself like an insect in a cocoon. The routine kept him alive, but it was destroying him. By day 3, he was hallucinating regularly. He'd see buildings that weren't there, hear voices in the wind. Once, he was absolutely certain he could smell bacon frying. He walked toward the smell for 20 minutes before he realized he was heading uphill, away from the river. He turned around, made it back to his last campsite, built another fire. The temperature that night dropped to -45. His body was cannibalizing muscle for fuel. He could feel himself getting weaker with each day. His hands shook constantly. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The hunger was so intense it became background noise, just part of the experience, like the cold, like the silence. He stopped thinking about rescue, stopped thinking about anything except the next 100 yards of river, the next fire, the next few hours of sleep. On the 8th day, he tried to leave the river to find higher ground. He thought maybe he could see farther, spot a road or a cabin or smoke from a settlement. He made it maybe 300 feet uphill before his legs gave out. He collapsed in the snow, lay there for 10 minutes trying to decide if he should just stay down, let the cold take him. It would be easier than walking, but something in him refused. He crawled back to the river, made another fire. That night was the coldest yet. And on the 9th day, just before dark, he saw it. A cabin, small, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, half buried in snow, smoke-stained logs, a single window with real glass. Crane thought he was hallucinating again. He'd seen phantom cabins before, but this one didn't disappear when he blinked. He stumbled toward it, fell twice, got up both times, reached the door. It was unlocked. Inside, he found a small cast-iron stove, a wooden cot, a table, and on that table, stacked like treasure, were cans of food. Condensed milk, canned peaches, beans, sugar in a tin, powdered milk in a sack. In the corner stood a rifle, a .22 caliber, ammunition in a box, mittens, warm clothing, a canvas tent, tools in a cache outside. Leon Crane stood in that cabin and understood he wasn't going to die today. He opened a can of peaches, ate them with his hands, made hot cocoa on the stove. The warmth hit his stomach and he almost threw up from the shock of it. He forced himself to eat slowly. Then he put wood in the stove, pulled on the mittens he found, real mittens, not the frozen cloth he'd been using. And for the first time in 9 days, Leon Crane slept more than 2 hours straight. The next morning he explored further downstream, found 2 more cabins, both abandoned, both rotting. He returned to the first cabin, the good one, and realized something that should have been obvious. If there's a cabin with supplies, someone must be close by. A village, a mining camp, something. He was wrong. He'd later learned this cabin belonged to a trapper named Phil Burrell, and Phil Burrell hadn't been to this cabin in years. The nearest human being was 60 miles away. The nearest settlement was 100 miles downstream at a place called Woodchopper. But Leon Crane didn't know that yet. So on the second morning, he filled his pockets with raisins and walked downstream expecting to find civilization around the next bend. He walked for 3 hours before the weakness forced him back. That walk back to the cabin taught Crane something crucial. He was still too weak to travel. 9 days of starvation had hollowed him out. His legs trembled after 3 hours of walking. His hands had developed frostbite. The skin on his fingers had turned waxy white in places. He needed time to recover, time to let the food rebuild what the hunger had destroyed, time to let his body heal. So he stayed. For 6 weeks, Leon Crane lived in Phil Burrell's cabin and fought to regain his strength. He ate twice a day, small portions. His stomach couldn't handle more after the starvation. He kept the stove burning constantly. The temperature outside never rose above 0. Most days it stayed between -20 and -40. At night it dropped even further. He could hear trees exploding in the cold, the sap freezing and splitting the trunks with cracks like rifle shots. The frostbite on his hands was getting worse. The tips of 3 fingers on his left hand had gone from white to gray. He knew what that meant. Dead tissue. Gangrene if he wasn't careful. He kept them wrapped, kept them warm, prayed they wouldn't have to be amputated. Every morning he unwrapped the cloth and checked the color. Every morning he was terrified of what he'd see. He found a map of Alaska in the cabin. Old, hand-drawn in some places, but it showed the Charley River, showed it flowing north to the Yukon, and it showed a settlement marked Woodchopper, where the river met the Yukon. He measured the distance with his fingers. Maybe 90 miles, maybe more. In summer, a strong hiker could cover that in a week. In winter, through deep snow, weakened by starvation, with frostbitten hands, it might take a month. It might kill him. But staying here would definitely kill him. The food was running low. By mid-February, he'd eaten through most of the canned goods. The powdered milk was almost gone. He could ration what remained, make it last maybe another 2 weeks. But then what? Wait for spring? Spring was 3 months away. The cabin had enough food for one trapper for 1 season, not enough for a man to survive until thaw. On February 11th, Crane made his decision. He would leave the next morning. He spent that day preparing, found wooden planks in the cache outside, built a crude sled to drag his supplies, packed the remaining food, the rifle and ammunition, extra clothing, the canvas tent, rope from the cabin. He filled a bag with the warmest gear he could find, the mittens that had probably saved his life, mucklucks that fit better than his old ones. He went to sleep early, tried to rest. Couldn't. His mind kept running through everything that could go wrong. The ice could break under him. The cold could kill him in his sleep. He could fall and break a leg and die slowly over days. He could walk right past Woodchopper in a blizzard and never know it. The rifle could jam. The sled could break. The food could run out. 100 ways to die, and maybe 1 way to survive. At dawn on February 12th, Leon Crane walked out of Phil Burrell's cabin for the last time. The sled was heavier than he'd expected. Dragging it through the snow required constant effort. His legs burned after the first mile. After 3 miles, he was exhausted. He made camp, built a fire, ate sparingly. The food had to last. He didn't know how long this journey would take. Could be 2 weeks, could be a month, could be forever. That night, the temperature dropped to -50, and in the morning, when Crane tried to stand, his left muckluck wouldn't move. His foot had broken through the ice during the night. The water had frozen instantly around the boot. The leather was now encased in a block of ice that weighed maybe 20 pounds. He had 2 choices: cut the boot off and lose his only footwear, or thaw it out and hope the frostbite didn't get worse. He built up the fire and started thawing. It took 3 hours to thaw the muckluck. 3 hours sitting by a fire while precious daylight burned away. 3 hours during which Crane had to fight the urge to just cut the boot off and wrap his foot in canvas and keep walking. But he knew that was suicide. Exposed feet in -50 degrees meant amputation at best, death at worst. So he waited, fed the fire, rotated the boot, and when the ice finally melted enough to free his foot, he checked for new frostbite damage. The skin was white, numb, but not gray, not dead, not yet. He wrapped it in extra cloth, put the muckluck back on, and kept walking. The sled became his enemy over the next 3 days. It was too heavy. The runners kept catching on hidden obstacles under the snow, rocks, frozen brush. The frame he'd built wasn't strong enough. It kept twisting. By the 3rd day, one of the runners had cracked. By the 4th day, the whole structure was coming apart. But Crane kept dragging it because the supplies were his only chance. Then on the 5th day, disaster. He was crossing a section of river that looked solid. The ice was thick, maybe 6 inches. He'd crossed similar spots a dozen times. But this time the sled's weight was too much. The ice cracked. Not a small crack, a spiderweb that spread in every direction. And before Crane could react, before he could drop the rope and run, the entire section gave way. He went into the water. The cold was so intense it stopped his breath. -50-degree air, 32-degree water. The difference felt like being stabbed. His body went into shock instantly. The current tried to pull him under the ice. He fought it, grabbed for the edge, missed, went under, came up gasping. The sled was gone. Disappeared downstream under the ice. All his food, the rifle, the extra clothing, everything except what he was wearing. He had maybe 2 minutes before hypothermia killed him. Crane clawed his way to the bank, hauled himself out. His clothes were already freezing solid. He could feel ice forming in the fabric. His fingers wouldn't work, couldn't grip anything. He stumbled away from the river, found a stand of spruce trees, started gathering branches with hands that had no feeling, broke them, piled them. His whole body was shaking so violently he could barely stand. The matches were in his parka pocket, soaked. He pulled them out, tried to strike one. It disintegrated. Tried another. Same result. The third match caught, barely. A tiny flame that guttered in the wind. He held it to the spruce needles with shaking hands. Prayed. The needles caught. The flame spread. And Leon Crane stripped off every piece of frozen clothing and stood naked beside that fire in -50-degree cold. He knew this was the closest he'd come to dying since the crash. Closer than the 9 days of starvation. Closer than the frostbite. If that match hadn't lit, he'd be dead right now, frozen solid within an hour. He hung his clothes near the fire, turned them constantly. It took 6 hours to get everything dry enough to wear. 6 hours during which he couldn't move more than 10 feet from the flames. 6 hours of darkness coming on, temperature dropping, knowing that if the fire went out before his clothes dried, he was finished. But the fire held. The clothes dried, and Crane put them back on and walked. He'd lost everything. The food, the rifle, the tent. All he had now was what he was wearing and the knife in his pocket. But he was alive, still moving, still heading downstream. 3 days later, delirious from hunger, he saw another cabin. This one was smaller than Burrell's, older, but it had food. Canned beans, flour, coffee. And Crane spent 3 days there eating and resting and preparing for the final push, because he knew he was running out of time, running out of strength. This had to be the last cabin before Woodchopper. It had to be. On March 9th, after 80 days in the wilderness, Leon Crane saw something he hadn't seen since the crash. Fresh tracks, a dog sled trail, leading away from the river into the trees. Crane followed the trail. His brain told him it might be old, might be from weeks ago, might lead nowhere, but his body didn't care. His legs just kept moving, following those sled runners through the trees, around bends, over small rises. The trail was recent. He could tell from the way the snow sat in the tracks. Maybe a day old, maybe less. After 2 hours, he saw smoke. Not a lot, just a thin line rising above the trees. But it was there, real, not a hallucination. He'd learned to tell the difference. Hallucinations moved when you blinked. Real smoke stayed put. This smoke stayed put. He walked faster, started jogging, fell twice, got up, kept moving. The cabin appeared through the trees, bigger than the others, smoke coming from a chimney, a dog team staked out front, actual living dogs, movement inside the structure. Crane stopped 50 yards away. For the first time in 80 days, he was about to speak to another human being. He didn't know what to say, didn't know if his voice still worked. He walked to the door, knocked. A man opened it, native Alaskan, maybe 40 years old, strong build. The man stared at Crane, took in the torn parka, the matted hair, the beard that had grown wild. The eyes sunk deep in black circles. The man's expression didn't change, but Crane saw something shift behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Not of who Crane was, but of what he was. A man who shouldn't be alive. Crane tried to speak. His voice came out cracked and strange. He identified himself as Lieutenant Crane of the United States Army Air Forces. Said he'd been in a little trouble. Said he was glad to see another person. The man's name was Albert Ames, trapper. This was his winter camp. His wife and children were inside. Ames listened to Crane's story. The crash, the walk, the cabins, the fall through the ice. And when Crane finished, Ames told him something that made the last 80 days suddenly make terrible sense. Crane had walked approximately 120 miles, from the headwaters of the Charley River all the way down to within 30 miles of the Yukon, through country that killed experienced trappers, through temperatures that made survival nearly impossible, with no training, no experience, no real equipment. Ames had been in Alaska his whole life, and he'd never heard of anyone doing what Crane had just done. City boy from Philadelphia, who'd never spent a night outdoors, walked 120 miles through the worst winter in memory, survived 81 days on luck and 2 cabins. Ames brought Crane inside, gave him food, let him see himself in a mirror for the first time since December. Crane barely recognized the face looking back. 2-inch beard black as coal, hair matted and covering his ears, skin burned dark from sun and wind, eyes staring out from deep black circles. He looked like something prehistoric, something that had crawled out of a cave. Ames told him they were 30 miles from Woodchopper, a mining camp on the Yukon River. Had a small airstrip. Planes came through sometimes. Ames could take him there by dog sled. It would take a day, maybe less. They left the next morning. The sled ride took 8 hours. Crane sat wrapped in furs while Ames drove the dog team across the frozen landscape. They reached Woodchopper just after dark. A collection of old buildings, maybe a dozen people total. Gold rush remnants barely hanging on. But they had a radio, and on March 11th, someone at Woodchopper raised Ladd Field on that radio and told them that First Lieutenant Leon Crane was alive. The operator didn't believe it at first. Crane had been listed as missing and presumed dead for nearly 3 months. The entire crew was considered lost. But the voice on the radio insisted. Crane was there, in Woodchopper, alive. The operator asked to speak with him. Crane got on the radio, identified himself, gave details only he would know. The operator went silent for a long moment, then said a plane would be there tomorrow. While he waited, Crane met the man who'd saved his life without knowing it, Phil Burrell, 65 years old, built like a bear, local legend. The cabin that had kept Crane alive for 6 weeks belonged to Burrell. The trapper listened to Crane's thanks and waved it off, said that's what the cabins were for, said it was custom in Alaska. You keep cabins stocked for strangers who need them. You never know when you might be that stranger. On March 14th, a bush pilot named Bob Rice landed his single-prop Stinson at Woodchopper. Crane climbed aboard. They took off, banked west, and 90 minutes later, Leon Crane touched down at Ladd Field. His commanding officer was waiting. So were the ground crews who'd searched for the crash site and found nothing. So were men who'd written Crane off as dead months ago. Crane's first question was about the rest of his crew, the 4 men who'd been on that B-24. The answer was what he'd feared. No sign of any of them. The base surgeon examined Crane within an hour of his arrival. The doctor expected to find a broken man, severe frostbite requiring amputations, malnutrition requiring weeks of hospitalization, psychological damage from 3 months of isolation and trauma. What he found instead shocked everyone at Ladd Field. Crane was in remarkably good health. Better than good. He'd actually gained weight. The canned food from Phil Burrell's cabin had done its work. The 6 weeks of rest had rebuilt muscle. The frostbite on his fingers had stopped progressing. The skin was damaged but not dead. No amputations necessary. His feet were fine. His core temperature was normal, blood pressure stable. The doctor wrote in his report that Crane appeared to be in better physical condition than men who'd spent the same 3 months on base doing regular duty. But there was work to be done. The other 4 members of Crane's crew were still missing. The Army had searched for the crash site in late December and early January, sent out multiple aircraft, covered hundreds of square miles, found nothing. The weather had been terrible, visibility near zero most days, and the search area was massive. Eastern Alaska was essentially unmapped wilderness. Finding one crashed bomber in that expanse was like finding a specific snowflake in a blizzard. Now they had Crane, and Crane knew exactly where the B-24 had gone down. He spent 2 days resting, eating real meals, sleeping in a real bed, called his parents in Philadelphia. His mother answered. She'd been told 3 months ago that her son was missing and presumed dead. Now she was hearing his voice on a crackling long-distance line from Alaska. She couldn't stop crying. His father got on the phone, asked if Leon was really okay, really alive. Crane told him yes, told him about the letter he'd used for kindling that first night, told him that letter had probably saved his life. His father went quiet, then said he was proud, said he'd see him soon. On March 16th, Crane joined an aerial reconnaissance mission. They flew east from Ladd Field, following the Charley River from the air. Crane sat in the back of a C-47 and watched the wilderness scroll past below. Everything looked different from the air. Smaller, less hostile. He found Phil Burrell's cabin from the smoke stains on the roof, found the spot where he'd gone through the ice, traced his entire route downstream. And then they reached the crash site. The wreckage was still there, scattered across the mountainside. The B-24 had hit nose first and broken apart. The fuselage was buried in snow. Both wings had sheared off. The tail section sat 100 yards uphill from the main impact point. Crane could see the burn patterns where the fuel had ignited, black snow spreading out like a stain. They marked the location, took photographs, flew back to base. And 2 days later, a ground recovery team hiked in. The team found 2 bodies, radio operator Ralph Wins and waist gunner James Seibert. Both had stayed with the aircraft. Both had died on impact. The team searched the surrounding area for pilot Harold Hoskin and flight engineer Richard Pompeo. Found nothing. The spring thaw was still months away. Much of the crash site was under 6 feet of snow. They'd have to come back later. Crane led a second recovery mission in October 1944. By then, the snow had melted. The team was able to search more thoroughly. They found scattered pieces of wreckage, personal effects, but no sign of Hoskin or Pompeo. The conclusion was grim. Pompeo had bailed out and either died on landing or died shortly after from the cold. His body was somewhere in the wilderness. Hoskin had likely stayed with the aircraft and been consumed in the fire. The crash had burned hot enough to cremate bone. The official report listed both men as killed in action, bodies unrecovered. Crane stayed at Ladd Field through the end of 1944, flew more test flights. The Army needed pilots who understood cold weather operations. Crane was now the world's leading expert on Arctic survival, whether he wanted to be or not. He flew dozens more missions, tested new equipment, helped develop better cold weather gear. The Eddie Bauer parka that had kept him alive became standard issue for Arctic operations. But something had changed in him, something the doctors couldn't see and the debriefings couldn't capture. He'd spent 81 days believing he was going to die. 81 days alone with nothing but his thoughts and the cold. That does things to a person. Changes the way they see the world. Changes what matters. In early 1945, Leon Crane requested a transfer stateside. The request was granted. He'd done enough. More than enough. The Army gave him an honorable discharge and sent him home to Philadelphia. 25 years old. Veteran of one of the most remarkable survival stories in military history. And he never wanted to see snow again. Leon Crane came home to a Philadelphia that didn't know what to do with him. The local papers ran a small story. Army pilot survives Alaska crash. A few paragraphs buried on page 6. His neighbors welcomed him back. His family was grateful he was alive. But nobody really understood what had happened up there. How do you explain 81 days alone in minus 50 degrees to people who've never seen real cold? How do you describe walking 120 miles through wilderness when the furthest most people walk is to the corner store? So Crane didn't try to explain. He just moved forward. He enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania using the GI Bill, studied aeronautical engineering. The same skills that had made him a good pilot translated well to aircraft design. He understood how planes worked, how they failed, what kept them flying and what brought them down, and he had first-hand experience with what happened when everything went wrong at once. After graduation, he went to work for a helicopter manufacturer. This was the late 1940s. Helicopters were still new technology, experimental, dangerous. Crane helped design rotor systems, worked on stability problems, made the machines safer, more reliable. He was good at it, good enough that he stayed in the industry for years, helped develop some of the first civilian helicopters, the ones that would eventually be used for rescue operations and medical transport. He got married, had 6 children, built a normal life, started a construction business with 3 of his kids in the 1970s. The business did well. Crane was a good businessman, methodical, careful. The same qualities that had kept him alive in Alaska served him well in civilian life. He didn't take unnecessary risks, didn't make impulsive decisions, thought everything through. But he rarely talked about the crash, rarely mentioned Alaska. His family knew the basic story. Plane went down, he walked out, survived. But Crane didn't elaborate, didn't go into details. When people asked about the war, he'd mention he'd been a pilot, leave it at that. The survival story stayed buried, known to a few military historians, a footnote in Arctic survival manuals, but largely forgotten. In 1976, a writer named John McPhee came to interview him. McPhee was working on a book about Alaska. Someone had told him about Crane's story. McPhee sat with Crane for hours, asked questions, took notes, and later published a brief account in his book, Coming into the Country. A few pages, maybe 2,000 words. It was the first time most of the public heard about what Leon Crane had done. But even then, it was just one chapter among many. The story didn't catch fire, didn't become widely known. Crane seemed fine with that. He'd moved on. Built a life that had nothing to do with frozen rivers and empty wilderness. He watched his children grow up, watched his business expand, lived quietly in Pennsylvania for decades. The Alaska chapter was closed, ancient history. But in Alaska, the story wasn't finished. The crash site remained undisturbed for 60 years, wreckage slowly rusting into the mountainside. The bodies of Harold Hoskin and Richard Pompeo still missing, still listed as unrecovered. Their families had never been able to bury them properly, never had closure. And in 2006, a National Park Service historian named Doug Beckstead decided to do something about it. Beckstead organized an expedition to the crash site, brought forensic specialists, ground-penetrating radar, modern recovery equipment. They spent weeks combing the area, sifting through soil, searching for any trace of the missing crew members. And in August 2006, 63 years after the crash, they found something. Bone fragments, metal buckles from a parachute harness, teeth. The remains were sent to the Military Identification Laboratory in Hawaii. DNA testing was impossible. The bone fragments were too degraded, but dental records provided a match. The teeth belonged to Second Lieutenant Harold Hoskin, age 28, pilot from Holton, Maine. The man who'd given the order to bail out. The man who'd stayed with the B-24 until the end. In April 2007, the lab confirmed the identification, and on September 7th of that year, military pallbearers carried a flag-draped coffin into the Fort Myer Old Post Chapel. Full honors, 21-gun salute. Harold Hoskin was finally coming home. His family was there. Siblings, nieces and nephews, people who'd spent their entire lives wondering what had happened to him. Leon Crane wasn't there. He'd died 5 years earlier on March 26, 2002, 82 years old, surrounded by family. He never knew they'd found Hoskin, never knew the story would eventually be told in full. But his children knew, and in 2005, 2 of them made a pilgrimage. They flew to Alaska, hired a bush pilot, followed their father's route down the Charley River, found the Burrell cabin, found the Ames cabin, both collapsed now, just piles of rotting logs being reclaimed by the forest. They stood where their father had stood, walked where he'd walked, tried to understand what he'd endured. And finally, they understood why he never talked about it. The crash site is still there, protected now as part of Charley River's National Preserve. The wreckage has been left in place as a memorial. Hikers occasionally make the trek. Stand where the B-24 hit, see the burn patterns still visible after 80 years. Leave flags for the men who died there. The National Park Service maintains a small display. Photographs, timeline, the basic facts of what happened on December 21, 1943. But the facts don't capture it, can't capture it. They don't capture what it means to be 24 years old and alone on a mountain in minus 50-degree cold with no food and no training and no realistic hope of rescue. They don't capture the decision to walk instead of wait, to keep moving when every rational thought says lie down and let the cold take you. They don't capture 9 days of starvation, the hallucinations, the frostbite, the moment when your foot freezes in a block of ice and you have to choose between cutting off your boot or waiting 3 hours by a fire while darkness comes on. The numbers tell part of the story. 81 days, 120 miles, minus 50 degrees, 5 men, 1 survivor. But numbers can't measure desperation, can't measure the mental strength it took to walk another mile when your body was eating itself for fuel, can't measure what it means to go through ice into water that can kill you in 2 minutes and somehow still find a way to build fire with frozen hands. Leon Crane had no business surviving. City boy from Philadelphia, no wilderness experience, no Arctic training. The Army taught him to fly bombers, not survive in sub-zero wilderness. By every reasonable measure, he should have died on day 1. Hypothermia, frostbite, starvation, any of 100 things that kill people in the Arctic. But he didn't die. He walked, and he kept walking until he found civilization. The survival instructors who studied his case later couldn't explain it. They wrote papers, analyzed his decisions, broke down what he did right and what should have killed him. The conclusion was always the same. Crane survived on a combination of luck, borrowed equipment, and pure stubborn refusal to quit. The cabin saved him. The Eddie Bauer parka saved him. Phil Burrell's Alaskan custom of stocking cabins for strangers saved him. But underneath all of that was something else. Something harder to quantify. The decision, made every single day for 81 days, to not give up. 4 men died on that mountain: Harold Hoskin, Richard Pompeo, Ralph Wins, James Seibert. All of them doing their duty, testing equipment in harsh conditions so that other pilots would have better gear, better chances. Their sacrifice wasn't in combat, but it was just as real, just as important. Hoskin got his crew into parachutes before the crash, made the call that gave Crane and Pompeo a chance. Wins got the distress signal out even though he knew they were going down. These weren't heroes in the traditional sense, no dramatic last stands, no enemy to fight. Just men doing dangerous work in a dangerous place. And Leon Crane carried their memory for the rest of his life. Rarely talked about it, but carried it. The guilt of being the one who survived. The knowledge that he'd walked away from a crash that killed 4 good men. That kind of thing doesn't leave you. Shapes everything that comes after. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who survived impossible odds through mental strength and sheer determination. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Leon Crane and his crew don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.